The thunder of hooves echoed across the plains as Grace Zimmerman raced her chestnut mare toward home, her heart as heavy as the dark clouds gathering on the horizon. At 32, she'd long ago stopped believing in fairy tales, especially after the doctor in Silver Creek had confirmed what 3 years of marriage had already told her: she would never bear a child of her own. The year was 1878, and the Dakota Territory was as unforgiving as it was beautiful. The wind whipped at Grace's skirts as she approached the small cabin she'd inherited after her husband Thomas died from pneumonia last winter. The loneliness of the place matched the emptiness inside her. "Easy, Penny," Grace murmured as she dismounted, patting the mare's neck before leading her to the small stable. "At least I've got you." Grace had been the daughter of a shopkeeper in a town 50 miles east. She'd married young, at 19, to a kind man with gentle eyes and dreams of building a cattle ranch. Thomas Zimmerman had been good to her, patient during the long months when her monthly courses came regular as clockwork, dashing their hopes again and again. They'd tried everything: folk remedies, doctor's tonics, prayers whispered in the dark. Nothing worked. Now he was gone, and she was left with a modest spread that was too much for one woman to manage, but too little to attract a proper buyer. Most days Grace wondered why she stayed. Perhaps it was the last thread connecting her to the life she'd hoped to build: a home filled with children's laughter, a family gathered around the hearth. As she pushed open the door to her cabin, the silence inside struck her anew. She'd spent the day in town, selling eggs and picking up supplies. The trip had taken longer than expected, and now twilight was settling over the plains. Grace lit a lamp and stoked the dying embers in the fireplace. She had just put on water to boil for tea when she heard it, a sound so unexpected it froze her in place. A cry. No, not just a cry. The unmistakable wail of an infant. Her mind racing, Grace grabbed the rifle Thomas had taught her to shoot and cautiously approached the door. The crying continued, more insistent now. Pressing herself against the wall, she eased the door open with the barrel of her gun. There, on her porch, lay a small bundle wrapped in a worn blanket. The baby's face was red with effort, tiny fists punching at the air. "Lord Almighty," Grace whispered, setting the rifle aside and dropping to her knees. She gathered the infant into her arms with trembling hands, instinctively cradling its head. "Where did you come from, little one?" The baby quieted somewhat at her touch, blinking up with deep blue eyes. Grace looked around frantically, searching the darkening prairie for whoever had left this child on her doorstep. That's when she saw him, a figure on horseback, watching from the edge of her property. As their eyes met across the distance, the rider nudged his horse forward, approaching slowly. Grace clutched the baby tighter, ready to retreat inside if necessary. But something in the man's posture kept her rooted to the spot. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. As he drew closer, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps in his mid-30s. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, his horse a magnificent black stallion that spoke of quality. "Madam," he said, stopping a respectful distance away and removing his hat. His hair was the color of wheat, his eyes a startling green against sun-bronzed skin. "I apologize for startling you." "Who are you?" Grace demanded, her arms protective around the infant. "And whose child is this?" The man dismounted, his movements fluid and careful, like he was trying not to spook a wild animal. "My name is Kieran Jackson. I'm a rancher from Montana Territory." He took a deep breath. "And that baby is my sister's child." The baby had quieted now, seemingly content in Grace's arms. "Your sister's?" she repeated. "Then why—" "My sister died 3 days ago," he said, his voice catching slightly. "Childbed fever. Her husband, my brother-in-law, was killed in a mining accident 2 months back. There's no one else." Grace looked down at the infant, so small and helpless. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Jackson, but I don't understand why you've brought this child to me." Kieran stepped closer, his hat still in his hands. "Mrs. Zimmerman, it is Mrs. Zimmerman, isn't it?" When she nodded, he continued. "I've been asking around. People in town speak highly of you. They say you're kind, hard-working, and—" He hesitated. "That you and your late husband wanted children, but were never blessed." Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. To think her private heartache was common knowledge, discussed by strangers. "That's hardly—" "I didn't mean to offend," he said quickly. "It's just that I've been writing for days, trying to figure out what to do. I can't raise a baby on my own, not with my ranch to run and no woman to help. I hoped—" He looked at her directly, his green eyes earnest. "I thought maybe God had a plan bigger than either of us could see." The audacity of it struck Grace speechless. This stranger had simply decided she would take in his orphaned niece or nephew without so much as a "by your leave." As if sensing her thoughts, Kieran added softly, "I'm not abandoning her. I intend to help, to provide. I just can't do it alone." "Her?" Grace whispered, looking down at the bundle in her arms. "Yes, a girl, Elizabeth Ann, after her mother. Though we called her Ellie." His voice grew husky with emotion. "She's just 7 days old." The baby stirred, making little mewling sounds. Without thinking, Grace adjusted her hold, swaying slightly. "Mr. Jackson, what exactly are you proposing?" He stepped closer still, close enough that she could see the fatigue etched in his face, the grief shadowing his eyes. "I'm asking if you'd help me raise her, if you'd be her mother in all the ways that matter." Grace's heart thundered in her chest. "And you would be—" "What?" "Her uncle, her guardian." He looked at the baby with such tenderness that Grace felt something twist inside her. "I'd be here as much as I could. I'd make sure you both wanted for nothing." "You're asking me to raise your niece while you go back to your ranch in Montana?" Grace clarified, trying to make sense of this incredible proposition. Kieran shook his head. "No, madam. I'm asking if I can buy the adjacent property, the Miller place, that's been sitting empty. I'd build it up, run cattle there. We'd be neighbors, raising Ellie together." Grace's mind whirled. The Miller property had been vacant for nearly 2 years since old Jim Miller died and his children moved east. It was good land, with access to the creek that ran through her own property. "You want us to raise this child, together? As what?" "This is highly irregular, Mr. Jackson." "I know it is," he admitted, "but these are irregular times. Ellie needs both of us a mother's love and a father's protection. I'm not asking for anything improper. We'd be neighbors, partners in her upbringing." He paused. "Unless someday you felt differently." The implication hung in the air between them. Grace looked down at the infant in her arms, now sleeping peacefully. This was madness. She barely knew this man. And yet— "She needs to be fed," Grace said finally. "And you look like you haven't slept in days. Come inside, Mr. Jackson. We'll talk more after I've tended to her." Relief washed over his face. "Thank you, Mrs. Zimmerman." "I haven't agreed to anything," she warned. "I understand." He gathered his horse's reins. "May I stable him with your mare?" Grace nodded, and as he led his stallion away, she looked down at the tiny life in her arms. Ellie's lashes lay like dark crescents against her cheeks, her rosebud mouth slightly open in sleep. Something long dormant unfurled in Grace's chest hope, dangerous and sweet. "What am I going to do with you?" she whispered to the sleeping infant. But even as she asked, she knew the answer. This child. This strange man, they had already begun to change everything. Inside, Grace realized the practicalities she was facing. She had no cradle, no baby clothes, nothing to feed an infant. When Kieran returned, she voiced these concerns. "I brought what I could," he said, retrieving saddlebags from where he'd left them by the door. He pulled out a small bundle of baby clothes, some cloths for diapers, and, most crucially, a glass bottle with a rubber nipple. "There's condensed milk," he explained. "The woman at the general store in the last town showed me how to prepare it." His competence surprised her, though his hands trembled slightly as he set the items on her table. "You've thought this through," Grace acknowledged. "Had 3 days of riding to do nothing but think," he replied with a weary smile. "Though I'll admit, I wasn't sure you'd even open your door." Grace prepared the milk while Kieran built up the fire. They worked in a strange, tense silence, two strangers bound by the sleeping infant. When the milk was ready, Grace tested it on her wrist as she'd seen mothers do, then gently roused Ellie to feed her. The baby latched onto the rubber nipple with surprising strength, her tiny hands curling and uncurling as she drank. "She has a good appetite," Grace said, a smile tugging at her lips despite herself. Kieran watched them, his expression unreadable. "You're natural with her." "I've helped deliver neighbors' babies," Grace said softly. "Tended them when their mothers needed rest. I always thought, She trailed off, unwilling to share that particular pain with this stranger, but Kieran seemed to understand. My sister wanted children desperately. Ellie was a blessing long awaited. Grace met his eyes over the baby's head. I'm truly sorry for your loss, Mr. Jackson. Kieran, he corrected gently, if we're to be, whatever we might be to each other, you should call me Kieran. Grace, she offered in return. When Ellie had been fed, changed, and settled into a makeshift bed, fashioned from a drawer lined with blankets, Grace finally allowed herself to consider the full magnitude of what Kieran was proposing. You said you'd buy the Miller place, she began, sitting across from him at her small table. How soon? I've already spoken with the bank in town, he said. They're holding the papers for me. I can finalize it tomorrow if you agree to this arrangement. And you'd build it up, run cattle? He nodded. I've done well in Montana. I have savings and I know ranching. The land here is good, similar to what I'm used to. Why not take Ellie back to Montana with you? Surely you could hire someone to help. Kieran's gaze dropped to his hands, strong and calloused, resting on the table. I thought of that, but a hired woman wouldn't love her, not like... He stopped, seeming to catch himself. And honestly, after losing Elizabeth and James, I couldn't bear to go back right away. I left my foreman in charge, told him I might not return. Grace studied him, this man who had ridden for days with a newborn, who had given up his established life to ensure his niece would have a proper home. Either he was the most dedicated uncle she'd ever encountered, or there was more to his story. There's something you're not telling me, she said directly. Kieran met her eyes then, and the depth of grief she saw there startled her. Elizabeth wasn't just my sister, he said quietly. She was my twin. We lost our parents young, raised each other really. When she died, his voice broke. Taking Ellie back to the ranch where Elizabeth should have been raising her own family, I couldn't do it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The raw honesty of his admission touched something in Grace. She knew about grief, about the way it hollowed you out and left you drifting. Thomas had been gone over 6 months, and still she sometimes turned to tell him something, only to find empty space where he should have been. I understand, she said simply. Kieran nodded, grateful for her lack of platitudes. So, you'll consider it, helping me raise Ellie? Grace looked toward the drawer where the baby slept. I need time to think. Of course. He stood, reaching for his hat. I've taken a room at the boarding house in town. I'll come back tomorrow, if that's all right. Yes, Grace agreed. And bring the papers for the Miller place. I'd like to see them. Hope flickered across his face. I will. After he'd gone, Grace sat beside the sleeping infant for a long time. It was madness, what he was proposing. They were strangers. She knew nothing about him beyond what he'd told her. And yet... She reached out one finger to touch Ellie's tiny hand. The baby reflexively grasped it, holding on even in sleep. And just like that, Grace knew she couldn't let this child go. Whatever arrangement she and Kieran Jackson might come to, Ellie had already claimed a piece of her heart. Morning brought a clarity Grace hadn't expected. She'd spent the night tending to Ellie's needs, changing and feeding her every few hours. The exhaustion felt strangely rewarding. By dawn, she'd made her decision. Kieran arrived mid-morning, leading a wagon loaded with supplies. The sight of him negotiating the rutted path to her cabin, his broad shoulders set with determination, sent an unexpected flutter through Grace's stomach. You've been busy, she remarked as he pulled up in front of her porch. Thought you might need a few things, he said, jumping down from the wagon seat. Cradle, proper baby clothes, more milk. He gestured to the items in the back. And I brought those papers. Grace nodded, bouncing Ellie gently in her arms. The baby was awake and alert, her blue eyes seeming to take in everything. I've been thinking about your proposal. Kieran stilled, his expression carefully neutral. And? I'll help you raise Ellie, Grace said, the words sending a thrill of both fear and excitement through her. But I have conditions. Relief washed over his face, quickly replaced by wariness. Name them. First, we need to be clear about our arrangement. I'll be her mother in every way that matters, as you put it. That means I have an equal say in her upbringing. Agreed, he said without hesitation. Second, While I understand you'll be building up the Miller place, you'll need somewhere to stay in the meantime. My barn has a small room that Thomas used as an office. It's clean and has a bed. You can stay there until your house is built." Kieran's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's generous, but are you sure it's appropriate?" Grace lifted her chin. "People will talk regardless of what we do. At least this way, you'll be close enough to help with Ellie and to help me with the chores Thomas used to handle." She paused. "Unless you'd prefer to ride back and forth from town every day." A smile tugged at his lips. "The barn sounds fine." "Good. Third condition, we need to be honest with each other. Always. No secrets, no holding back. If this is going to work, we need to trust each other." Kieran's expression sobered. "Agreed. Anything else?" Grace took a deep breath. "Yes. I want to know why you really chose me. Out of all the women in this territory, why bring Ellie to my door?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He removed his hat, running a hand through his wheat-colored hair. "I told you people spoke highly of you in town." "There's more," Grace insisted, shifting Ellie to her other arm. "I can see it in your eyes." Kieran was silent for a long moment, looking out over the prairie stretching beyond her property. Finally, he said, "Elizabeth knew about you. Before she died, she made me promise to find a good mother for Ellie. She'd heard about you from a mutual acquaintance, Mrs. Larson, who moved here from our town about a year ago." Grace knew Betsy Larson, a kindly widow who lived on the outskirts of Silver Creek. They weren't close, but they exchanged pleasantries at church. "Mrs. Larson wrote to Elizabeth occasionally," Kieran continued. "In one letter, she mentioned a brave young widow who'd lost her husband but kept his dream alive, running their small ranch alone. She wrote that this woman had a gift with children but had been denied her own." He met Grace's eyes directly. "Elizabeth said if anything happened to her, I should find you. Said it would be God's way of healing two hurting souls." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. The thought that her private sorrow had been discussed in letters to strangers stung, but beneath that was something else, a strange sense that perhaps Ellie's arrival wasn't mere coincidence. "I see," she said softly. "I'm sorry if that upsets you," Kieran said. "I debated whether to tell you." "No secrets," Grace reminded him. "That's our agreement," he nodded. No secrets. They spent the rest of the day settling into a tentative routine. Kieran brought the cradle and other supplies inside, then set about reinforcing the chicken coop, while Grace tended to Ellie and prepared a simple meal. By evening, Kieran had moved his belongings into the barn room and joined Grace for supper. As they ate, Grace found herself studying him when he wasn't looking. There was a steadiness to Kieran Jackson that reminded her of Thomas, but where her husband had been gentle and bookish, Kieran was all quiet strength and practicality. His hands were calloused from work, his movements efficient. Yet, when he held Ellie, those same hands became remarkably gentle. "Tell me about your ranch in Montana," Grace said as they finished their meal. Kieran's eyes lit up. "It's good land, 5,000 acres along the Yellowstone River. Started with just 100 head of cattle and built it up over 10 years. Pride colored his voice. Had 20 men working for me by the end. And you're willing to give all that up?" "Not giving it up entirely," he clarified. "My foreman, John, has been with me since the beginning. He'll keep it running, send me my share of the profits. But yes, I'm starting over here. For Ellie." "And for yourself," Grace observed. Kieran looked at her sharply, then nodded. "Yes. After Elizabeth?" He swallowed hard. "Some places hold too many memories." Grace understood that all too well. There were days when she could barely stand to be in the bedroom she'd shared with Thomas, when the sight of his empty chair by the fire made her throat close with grief. "Will you tell me about your husband?" Kieran asked, seeming to sense her thoughts. Grace smiled sadly. "Thomas was a dreamer, saw potential in this land that others missed. He had plans to build a proper ranch, raise cattle and horses." She gestured around the modest cabin. This was just the beginning of what he envisioned. What stopped him? Money mostly. We were saving, building slowly. Then he got sick last winter. She looked down at her hands. Pneumonia took him in 3 days. Kieran was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry, Grace." She nodded her thanks, unwilling to say more. The grief was still too raw, too private to share fully. As if sensing the shift in mood, Ellie began to fuss in her cradle. Grace rose to tend to her, but Kieran was already moving. "I've got her," he said, lifting the baby with surprising skill. "You cooked." "Fair's fair." Grace watched as he changed Ellie's diaper with competent hands, speaking to her in low, soothing tones. When he finished, he cradled her against his chest, rubbing her back gently. "You're good with her," Grace observed. Kieran looked up, a sad smile playing at his lips. "Elizabeth had 2 miscarriages before Ellie. I helped out a lot during those pregnancies, learned more than most men about babies, I suppose." The tenderness in his voice touched Grace deeply. This arrangement might be unconventional, but Kieran Jackson clearly loved his niece. For Ellie's sake, Grace could make this work. And if her heart sometimes beat a little faster when he smiled at her, well, that was something she would need to guard against. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern. Kieran rode into town each morning to oversee the beginning stages of construction on the Miller property, returning by midday to help with chores around Grace's farm. Evenings were spent tending to Ellie and planning for the future. To Grace's surprise, they worked well together. Kieran was direct but respectful, never assuming authority over her decisions for the farm or for Ellie. He fixed the sagging porch, repaired the leaky roof, and reinforced the corral fence, all things Thomas had planned to do before his illness. The physical changes to her home were matched by the emotional transformation taking place within Grace. Each day with Ellie filled a void she'd thought would remain empty forever. The baby was thriving, gaining weight, and beginning to respond to their voices with coos and almost smiles. And then there was Kieran. Grace found herself looking forward to his return each day, enjoying their conversations over dinner. He was well read for a rancher, knowledgeable about cattle breeding and land management in ways that reminded her of Thomas's ambitions. 3 weeks after Kieran's arrival, Grace was hanging laundry in the yard when Mrs. Peterson and her daughter Abigail rode up in their wagon. "Grace Zimmerman," Mrs. Peterson called, her plump face alight with curiosity. "We've been hearing the most interesting rumors in town." Grace straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "Martha, Abigail, what brings you out this way?" Mrs. Peterson climbed down from the wagon with Abigail's help, her eyes darting toward the house. "Well, when we heard you had a gentleman staying on your property and a baby of all things, I said to Abigail, we simply must check on dear Grace." The thinly veiled nosiness made Grace sigh internally. "How thoughtful of you." "Is it true?" Abigail asked eagerly. At 20, she was Silver Creek's most determined gossip. "People are saying you've taken in an orphan with some handsome rancher from Montana." Before Grace could answer, Kieran emerged from the barn, leading his black stallion. He'd removed his shirt in the heat, and Grace couldn't help noticing how the sun gleamed on his muscled shoulders. Quickly she looked away, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "Ladies," Kieran called, grabbing his shirt from a fence post and shrugging it on as he approached. "You must be neighbors of Grace's." Mrs. Peterson's eyes widened at the familiar use of Grace's given name. "Indeed we are. I'm Martha Peterson, and this is my daughter Abigail. We live about 3 miles east." Kieran introduced himself with easy courtesy, explaining that he was building up the Miller property and staying in Grace's barn until his house was complete. "Grace has kindly agreed to help me raise my niece," he added, his tone matter of fact. "Your niece?" Mrs. Peterson repeated, her expression a mixture of disappointment and renewed interest. "We'd heard there was a baby, but not the circumstances." "My sister died in childbirth," Kieran said, his voice tightening slightly. "Her husband was already gone. Grace is giving Ellie what I can't, a mother's care." The simple explanation seemed to confuse the Petersons, who exchanged glances. "How unusual," Mrs. Peterson finally said. "And you're staying in the barn, you say?" "Yes, madam," Kieran confirmed, his eyes glinting with what Grace recognized as suppressed amusement. "Though I'm hoping to have the new house habitable within a month." "I see." Mrs. Peterson's tone suggested she saw a great deal more than was being said. "Well, we won't keep you from your work. Grace, perhaps you'd like to bring the baby to church this Sunday. It's been some time since we've seen you there." Grace had avoided church since Thomas's funeral, unwilling to face the pitying glances and well-meaning but painful questions about her plans. Now she found herself nodding. "Yes, I think we will. Thank you for stopping by, Martha. After the Petersons departed, Grace and Kieran exchanged looks. That went well, he said dryly. Grace laughed despite herself. They'll have the whole town talking by sundown. Does that bother you? He asked, suddenly serious. Grace considered the question. It should, I suppose. A respectable widow doesn't invite an unrelated man to stay on her property, but... She shrugged. For Ellie, I can weather a little gossip. Kieran's eyes softened. You're a remarkable woman, Grace Zimmerman. The warmth in his voice sent a flutter through her chest. I should check on Ellie, she said, turning quickly toward the house. As she predicted, their arrangement became the primary topic of conversation in Silver Creek. On Sunday, when Grace entered the small church with Ellie in her arms and Kieran at her side, the congregation's reaction was immediate. Whispers rippled through the pews, heads turning to watch their progress. Grace held her head high, focusing on Pastor Wilson's welcoming smile rather than the curious stares. They settled into a pew near the back, Kieran taking Ellie so Grace could arrange her skirts. The service passed in a blur of hymns and scripture readings. Grace was acutely aware of Kieran beside her, of his deep voice joining the congregation in song, of the protective way he cradled Ellie. Despite the stares and whispers, there was something right about sitting there, as a family, even if they weren't one in the conventional sense. After the service, they were immediately surrounded. Women cooed over Ellie, men clapped Kieran on the shoulder, and asked about his plans for the Miller property. Grace found herself explaining their arrangement again and again, surprised by how many seemed to accept it once they understood the circumstances. You're good for business, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Turner, the general store owner, declared. Supplies for a new house, ranch equipment, Silver Creek welcomes men of enterprise. And beautiful babies, Mrs. Wilson, the pastor's wife added, smiling at Ellie. She looks just like you, Mr. Jackson, same chin. Grace caught Kieran's eye over Mrs. Wilson's head. He seemed as startled as she was by the observation. It was true, though there was something in the set of Ellie's small features that echoed her uncle's. As they prepared to leave, Pastor Wilson approached them. Mrs. Zimmerman, Mr. Jackson, a moment, if you please. Grace tensed, expecting a lecture on propriety. Instead, the kindly pastor smiled gently. I wanted to say that I admire what you're doing for this child, he said. The Lord works in mysterious ways, bringing people together to care for his littlest ones. Thank you, Pastor, Kieran said, his relief evident. Of course, Pastor Wilson continued, lowering his voice. There might come a time when you wish to formalize your arrangement, for the child's sake and perhaps for your own. When that time comes, my door is always open. Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks at the pastor's implication. That's very kind, but Mr. Jackson and I are simply partners in raising Ellie, Kieran finished smoothly. But we appreciate your understanding, Pastor. On the ride home, they were both quiet, processing the community's reaction. Finally, Kieran broke the silence. I'm sorry if today was difficult for you. Grace shook her head, adjusting Ellie in her arms. Actually, it was easier than I expected. People were kind, mostly. The pastor seemed to have certain expectations, Kieran observed carefully. Grace kept her eyes on Ellie's sleeping face. People will always have expectations. What matters is what's best for Ellie. Kieran nodded, though something in his expression suggested he wanted to say more. Instead, he changed the subject, pointing out a hawk circling overhead and telling her about the different raptors common in Montana. As the weeks passed, their lives settled into a comfortable rhythm. Kieran's house on the Miller property took shape a sturdy two-story structure with wide porches and large windows. He'd hired local men for the construction, earning goodwill in the community with fair wages and respectful treatment. Meanwhile, Ellie grew and changed daily. She smiled now, a gummy grin that made Grace's heart swell. She'd begun to roll over and babble, endlessly fascinating both her guardians with each new accomplishment. Grace found herself watching Kieran with Ellie, noting the tenderness that transformed his weather-worn face when he played with the baby. She'd catch him singing softly as he rocked Ellie to sleep, old trail songs and lullabies his mother had sung to him and Elizabeth. These glimpses of his gentler side stirred feelings in Grace that both excited and frightened her. She hadn't expected to feel this way again, this awareness of a man as more than just a friend or neighbor. Thomas had been gone only 8 months. Was it disloyal to feel her heart quickening when Kieran smiled at her across the dinner table? And yet, she couldn't deny the growing connection between them. They talked late into the evening after Ellie was asleep, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes for the future. Kieran spoke of his plans for the ranch, his dreams of building something lasting. Grace found herself confiding her own ambitions, the vegetable garden she wanted to expand, her ideas for preserving and selling produce in town. One evening in late June, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. Ellie was asleep inside, exhausted from an afternoon of determined attempts to crawl. "House will be ready next week," Kieran said, breaking a comfortable silence. Grace nodded, feeling an unexpected pang at the thought of him moving out. "The men have worked quickly. They're good workers." He hesitated. "I've been thinking about how we'll manage once I'm living there." Grace turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" "Ellie," he said simply. "She can't be in 2 places at once." It was a practical concern they'd both been avoiding. Ellie had become the center of both their worlds, her care seamlessly shared between them. With Kieran moving to his own home, that arrangement would necessarily change. "What do you suggest?" Grace asked, her chest tight with the fear that he might want to take Ellie to live with him permanently. Kieran leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I was thinking she could stay primarily with you. He smiled softly. "You're her mother in all the ways that matter now. But I'd come over each day, or you could bring her to the new house sometimes." Relief washed through Grace. "That seems sensible. And I'd still help around here," he added quickly. "The arrangement has worked well for both of us, I think." Grace nodded, unable to deny that Kieran's presence had made her life easier in many ways. Beyond the physical labor he contributed, there was a comfort in having someone to share decisions with, someone who noticed when she was tired and stepped in without being asked. "It has," she agreed softly. Kieran turned to look at her directly, his green eyes intent in the fading light. "Grace, there's something else I've been wanting to discuss." The seriousness in his tone made her pulse quicken. "Yes?" He took a deep breath. The pastor wasn't wrong that day at church. People have expectations about men and women who live in close proximity, who raise a child together. Grace's mouth went dry. "What are you saying, Kieran?" "I'm saying that in the months we've known each other, I've come to admire you greatly." His voice was steady, though she could see tension in the set of his shoulders. "You're strong, kind, intelligent. You love Ellie as if she were your own, and He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "I find myself thinking of you as more than just Ellie's guardian, more than a partner in this arrangement we've made." Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. "Kieran, you don't need to answer now," he said quickly. "I know it's been less than a year since you lost your husband. I know this began as a practical arrangement for Ellie's sake. But I want you to know that my feelings have changed, deepened." He met her eyes directly. "When the time is right, if the time is ever right, I would be honored to ask you to be my wife." The words hung in the air between them, momentous and terrifying. Grace looked away, out at the darkening prairie, trying to order her thoughts. "I don't expect an answer now," Kieran repeated gently. "Just think about it." Grace nodded, unable to form words around the tangle of emotions in her chest. Part of her wanted to reach for him, to confess that she'd been feeling the same confusing, wonderful connection. Another part held back, bound by loyalty to Thomas and fear of opening herself to potential heartbreak. Kieran seemed to understand her silence. He stood, his movements careful and deliberate. "I should check on the horses before turning in." As he walked toward the barn, Grace remained on the porch, her mind whirling. Kieran Jackson wanted to marry her. The thought was both exhilarating and frightening. Marriage would make their unconventional family legitimate in the eyes of society. It would secure Ellie's future, give her both a mother and a father. But marriage meant opening her heart again, risking the devastating grief she'd experienced when Thomas died. It meant building a life with a man she'd known for mere months. No matter how deep their connection seemed, Grace sat for a long time, watching the stars appear one by one in the vast Dakota sky. When she finally went inside, her decision wasn't made, but she knew she needed to search her heart carefully in the days ahead. The following week passed in a blur of activity. Kieran's house was completed, and he spent long days moving furniture and supplies from town. He'd ordered a fine oak bedroom set, a large kitchen table with chairs, and comfortable parlor furniture, all signs of his intention to create a permanent home. Grace helped where she could, bringing lunch to the workers and offering suggestions on arranging the rooms. They maintained a careful politeness with each other, neither mentioning Kieran's declaration on the porch. Yet, Grace caught him watching her sometimes, his eyes filled with a patient hope that made her breath catch. Ellie, oblivious to the tension between her guardians, continued to flourish. She'd mastered rolling from her back to her stomach, and was working diligently on the reverse. Her babbling had become more conversational, with distinct sounds that sometimes almost formed words. On the day Kieran was to move into his new house, Grace woke early, a knot of anxiety in her stomach. She'd grown accustomed to his presence, the sound of his boots on the porch, his deep voice greeting her in the morning, the security of knowing he was just a short walk away if she needed help. After breakfast, she watched as he loaded the last of his belongings into his wagon. Ellie sat on a blanket in the yard, happily playing with a wooden rattle he'd carved for her. "That's the last of it," Kieran said, securing a trunk in the wagon bed. Grace nodded, trying to keep her expression neutral. "The house looks wonderful. You should be proud." "I couldn't have done it without your advice," he said, his eyes warm as they met hers. "Especially for the nursery." They'd spent hours planning the room that would be Ellie's when she stayed with Kieran, a sunny corner bedroom with a large window overlooking the creek. Grace had helped choose the pale yellow paint and had sewn curtains from fabric they'd purchased in town. "Will you and Ellie come for dinner tonight?" Kieran asked, "to celebrate the house being finished?" "Of course," Grace agreed, relieved that he wasn't simply disappearing into his new home. "What time should we come? Around 5? That'll give me time to get everything settled and prepare a meal." He smiled. "Nothing fancy, mind you. My cooking skills are limited." "We'll be there," Grace promised. After he'd gone, she found herself moving restlessly around the cabin, feeling the emptiness of the space in a way she hadn't since Thomas died. Ellie seemed to sense her mood, becoming fussy and difficult to settle for her nap. "Shh, little one," Grace soothed, rocking her gently. "Everything's changing, isn't it? But we'll be all right." As Ellie finally drifted to sleep, Grace made her decision. She would go to Kieran's dinner with an open heart and an honest answer to his unspoken question. These past months had shown her that life could begin again after loss, that love could grow in the most unexpected circumstances. She was afraid, of course she was, but she was also hopeful, in a way she hadn't been since the doctor in Silver Creek had confirmed her inability to bear children. With Kieran and Ellie, she'd found a family she never expected. Perhaps it was time to embrace it fully. At 5 o'clock, Grace approached Kieran's new house, Ellie in her arms, and a freshly baked apple pie balanced carefully in one hand. The house looked welcoming in the late afternoon sun, smoke curling from the chimney. The wide front porch adorned with 2 rocking chairs. Before she could knock, the door swung open, revealing Kieran in a clean white shirt, his hair still damp from washing. "Right on time," he said, his smile brightening his entire face. Come in, come in." The interior of the house was simple, but well crafted, with polished wooden floors and large windows that flooded the rooms with light. The furniture Kieran had chosen was sturdy and practical, with touches of elegance in the carved details and rich upholstery. "It's beautiful," Grace said sincerely, taking in the care evident in every corner. "You've created a real home here." That was the idea. Kieran took Ellie from her, lifting the baby high above his head to make her giggle. "What do you think, Ellie? Do you like your uncle's new house?" Ellie responded with delighted babbling, reaching for Kieran's face with pudgy hands. "I'll take that as approval," he laughed, settling her against his hip. "Dinner's almost ready. Nothing elaborate, just beef stew and biscuits." "It smells wonderful," Grace assured him, following him into the kitchen. The meal was indeed simple but delicious, the beef tender and the biscuits light and fluffy. They talked easily as they ate, discussing Kieran's plans for the ranch and Grace's latest letter from her sister in Pennsylvania. After dinner, they moved to the parlor, where Kieran had built a small fire to ward off the evening chill. Ellie played on a blanket spread before the hearth, thoroughly investigating a set of wooden blocks Kieran had made for her. "She's growing so fast," Kieran observed, watching the baby with evident pride. "Seems like yesterday she was that tiny bundle on your doorstep." Grace nodded, her throat suddenly tight with emotion. "I can hardly remember what life was like before her, before you brought her to me." Kieran's eyes lifted to hers, intense and searching. "Do you ever regret it? Taking us both into your life?" "Never," Grace said without hesitation. "You gave me a gift I thought I'd never have." "A child," he said softly. "Yes, and more." Grace took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Kieran, what you said last week, about your feelings changing." He went very still, his eyes never leaving her face. "Yes? Mine have changed too." The words came easier than she expected, falling from her lips with the weight of truth. "I wasn't looking for this. After Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over. But then you arrived with Ellie, and everything changed." Kieran moved to sit beside her on the sofa, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, but not touching her. "Grace, are you saying—" "I'm saying that I care for you," she interrupted, needing to get the words out before courage failed her. "Deeply, in a way I didn't expect to feel again. And I'm terrified by it, but also hopeful." The smile that spread across Kieran's face was like the sun breaking through clouds. Slowly giving her time to pull away if she wished, he reached for her hand. His palm was warm and calloused against hers, his touch gentle but sure. "I don't want to rush you," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "We have time, all the time we need." Grace looked down at their joined hands, then up at his face so open, so full of hope and longing that matched her own. "I've been thinking about what the pastor said," she admitted, "about formalizing our arrangement." Kieran's hand tightened on hers. "Have you now?" "It would make sense," she said, trying to sound practical, despite the racing of her heart. "For Ellie's sake, and for the ranch combining our properties would make a more viable operation." "Very sensible reasons," Kieran agreed, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Any others?" Grace felt a smile tugging at her lips. "Perhaps one or two." "Such as?" "Such as the fact that I find myself watching for you every morning," she confessed. "Or how I feel when you smile at me across the dinner table. Or how empty the house felt today after you left." Kieran's free hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch reverent. "Grace Zimmerman, if you're saying what I think you're saying, you're about to make me the happiest man in the Dakota Territory." "I'm saying yes," she whispered, "if you're asking." "I'm asking." His voice was fervent, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Grace, will you marry me? Will you be my wife, Ellie's mother, my partner in everything?" "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it." Kieran's smile was brilliant as he leaned forward, pausing just short of her lips to whisper, "May I?" Grace answered by closing the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened with all the feeling they'd been holding back. His arms went around her, drawing her closer, and Grace felt something within her blooming, unfurling like a flower after a long winter. When they finally broke apart, both breathing quickly, Ellie gave a loud squeal from her blanket. As if applauding their decision, they both laughed, the joy of the moment bubbling over. Kieran reached down to scoop Ellie into his arms, bringing her up to sit between them on the sofa. "What do you think, Ellie?" he asked, his voice playful. "Should Grace and I get married?" Ellie babbled enthusiastically, reaching out to pat Grace's cheek with one small hand. "I'll take that as approval," Grace smiled, catching the tiny fingers and pressing a kiss to them. Kieran's expression grew serious as he looked at her over Ellie's head. "I want you to know something, Grace. I didn't plan this when I first came here. I truly just wanted to find a good home for Ellie." "I know," she assured him. "But somewhere along the way," he continued, "watching you with her, getting to know you, I fell in love, completely and utterly in love." The words, spoken aloud for the first time, sent a thrill through Grace's body. "I love you too," she whispered, the admission both frightening and liberating. "I think I have for some time now." Ellie, unimpressed with the adult's conversation, began to fuss, reaching for one of her blocks that had rolled away. Always keeping us grounded, this one, Kieran laughed, setting her back on the blanket. He turned back to Grace, his expression growing thoughtful. How soon would you like to marry? I don't want to rush you if you need more time. Grace considered the question. Part of her felt she should observe a full year of mourning for Thomas, but another part recognized that life was too short, too precious to waste in unnecessary waiting. Thomas himself had always urged her to seize happiness where she found it. I don't want to wait too long, she decided. Perhaps after the harvest. That would give us time to plan, and it would be past the 1-year mark since Thomas died. Kieran nodded. October, then. A fall wedding. Yes, Grace agreed, liking the sound of it. And after? Would we live here or at my place? I built this house with a family in mind, Kieran admitted. But your place has the established barn, the chicken coop, the garden. He thought for a moment. What if we use both? Live here, but keep your place for the farming operations. The properties adjoin, it's not far. It was a practical solution, and one that appealed to Grace. Her cabin held memories of Thomas that were both precious and painful. Starting fresh in Kieran's house while maintaining the farm she and Thomas had built felt like the right balance of honoring the past while embracing the future. That sounds perfect, she agreed. They spent the rest of the evening planning their future together, discussing how they would combine their ranching operations, which furniture to keep from each household, even tentative ideas for their wedding. Through it all, Ellie played contentedly, occasionally demanding attention, but mostly happy to be part of their circle of love. As the hour grew late, Grace reluctantly prepared to leave. I should get Ellie home to bed, she said, gathering the drowsy baby. Kieran nodded, though his expression showed his reluctance to see them go. I'll walk you back. The night was clear, the moon casting enough light to illuminate their path across the connecting fields between the properties. Kieran carried Ellie, who had fallen asleep against his shoulder, while Grace walked beside him, their hands occasionally brushing in a way that sent pleasant shivers up her arm. At her door, Kieran carefully transferred the sleeping baby to Grace's arms. I'll come by in the morning, he promised. Help with the chores before I head to town to order those fence posts. I'd like that, Grace said softly. He bent to kiss her. A gentle good night that held the promise of all their tomorrows. Sleep well, my love. As Grace watched him walk back toward his new house, Ellie warm and heavy in her arms, she felt a sense of rightness settle over her. Life had taken unexpected turns, bringing sorrow and joy in equal measure. But standing there in the moonlight, with the promise of a new family taking shape around her, Grace knew she had found her way home. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Silver Creek. Most reactions were positive. The townspeople had grown accustomed to their unusual arrangement and seemed pleased to see it taking a more conventional turn. Pastor Wilson was particularly delighted, offering to perform the ceremony and providing gentle counsel as they prepared for marriage. Grace was surprised by how easily she settled into the role of bride-to-be. She'd never expected to marry again, had resigned herself to a solitary life after Thomas. Yet here she was, working with Mrs. Wilson and other women from church to plan a modest but joyful wedding celebration. The months leading to October passed in a whirlwind of activity. Kieran's ranch began to take shape, with cattle purchased from neighboring spreads and horses brought down from his Montana property. He hired 2 local men as ranch hands, teaching them his methods and involving them in his vision for the land. Grace expanded her vegetable garden and chicken flock, selling eggs and produce in town to supplement their income. Between the 2 of them, they were building something substantial, a legacy for Ellie and any other children who might come into their lives. Ellie continued to grow and develop, babbling constantly and finally mastering the art of crawling, which led to daily adventures as she explored her expanding world. She knew both Grace and Kieran now, reaching for them with equal trust and affection. By the time October arrived, bringing with it crisp air and golden leaves, Grace felt ready not just for the wedding, but for the life that would follow. She'd packed up her personal belongings from the cabin, sorting through Thomas's things with a bittersweet mixture of sadness and acceptance. Some items she kept for memory's sake. Others she gave to neighbors who could use them. The wedding day dawned clear and cool, the sky an endless blue above the prairie. Grace dressed in her bedroom at the cabin, assisted by her sister Margaret, who had traveled from Pennsylvania for the occasion. Her dress was new, but simple cream-colored cotton, with lace at the collar and cuffs, practical enough to wear again, but special enough for the important day. "You look beautiful," Margaret said, securing the last of Grace's hairpins. "Thomas would be happy for you, you know." Grace met her sister's eyes in the small mirror. "Do you really think so?" "I know so," Margaret assured her. "He only ever wanted your happiness. And this Kieran, he's a good man. I can see it in how he looks at you, how he cares for Ellie." Grace nodded, touched by her sister's understanding. "I never expected this," she admitted. "After the doctor told me I couldn't have children, after Thomas died, I thought that dream was over. And now?" A smile spread across Grace's face as she thought of Kieran and Ellie waiting at the church. "Now, I have everything I ever wanted." The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful, held in the small white church in Silver Creek. Nearly everyone in town attended, filling the pews and spilling out onto the church steps. Kieran stood at the altar in a new black suit, his normally tanned face pale with emotion, as Grace walked down the aisle on the arm of Mr. Peterson, who had kindly offered to give her away in the absence of her father. Ellie sat with Margaret in the front pew, dressed in a tiny white dress with a blue ribbon. When she spotted Grace, she let out a delighted squeal and reached out her arms, causing ripples of laughter through the congregation. Pastor Wilson's service was brief but heartfelt, acknowledging the unusual circumstances that had brought them together while celebrating the love that had grown between them. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Kieran's kiss was tender but confident, a promise of the life they would build together. The celebration afterward was held at their new home, with tables set up in the yard and food contributed by nearly every woman in town. There was music and dancing, children playing games on the grass, men discussing cattle prices and weather patterns. Through it all, Grace moved with a sense of wonderment, accepting congratulations and introducing her sister to neighbors. As evening approached, guests began to depart, offering final good wishes and hugs. Margaret would stay with Ellie at the cabin for the night, giving the newlyweds privacy for their first evening as husband and wife. The arrangement had made Grace blush when Margaret suggested it, but now she felt only gratitude for her sister's thoughtfulness. Finally, they were alone. Kieran closed the front door behind the last guests and turned to Grace, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and joy. "Mrs. Jackson," he said, the name still new and wonderful on his lips. "Mr. Jackson," she returned with a smile. He crossed to her in 3 long strides, gathering her into his arms with a tenderness that made her heart swell. "Are you happy, Grace? Truly?" She looked up at him. This man who had appeared on her doorstep with a baby and an impossible proposal, who had slowly and steadily won her heart. Happier than I ever thought possible. His kiss was different now, deeper, more intimate, with the knowledge that they had all night, all their lives, to explore this new aspect of their relationship. Grace responded eagerly, her earlier nervousness giving way to a yearning she'd kept carefully controlled during their engagement. Later, much later, they lay together in the large oak bed, the moonlight spilling through the window to silver Kieran's bare shoulder as he slept beside her. Grace watched him, marveling at how completely her life had transformed in just 6 months. She had a husband who loved her, a daughter in all but blood, a home and ranch that were thriving under their combined care. The emptiness that had haunted her after Thomas's death, that had deepened with each passing month of childlessness, had been filled in ways she could never have imagined. As if sensing her thoughts, Kieran stirred, his arm tightening around her waist. "Can't sleep?" he murmured, his voice rough with drowsiness. "Just thinking," she whispered back, nestling closer to his warmth. "Good thoughts, I hope." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "The best," she assured him. "About how lucky I am, how complete." He was silent for a moment, his hand tracing lazy patterns on her back. "You know," he said finally, "I never told you something about the day I brought Ellie to you." Grace raised her head to look at him in the dim light. "What's that?" "When you opened the door and I saw you with her in your arms, it was like a picture I'd carried in my heart without knowing it." His voice was soft, reflective. "You looked right together, like you belonged to each other. And in that moment, I knew I'd made the right choice, no matter what you decided about our arrangement." Grace felt tears prick her eyes at the simple honesty of his words. "It felt right to me, too," she admitted, "from the first moment." Kieran pulled her closer, his kiss tender with renewed passion. "Sleep now, my love. Tomorrow is the first day of our life together." As Grace drifted toward sleep in her husband's arms, she felt a profound sense of gratitude for the twists of fate that had brought them to this moment. Her dreams of a family had indeed faded after years of disappointment and loss, but life had a way of offering second chances when least expected. The following morning, they collected Ellie from Margaret, the three of them sharing breakfast together as an official family for the first time. As Kieran placed Ellie in Grace's arms, his eyes shining with love for both of them, he whispered words that echoed in her heart. "Ours at last," he said softly. "Our family, our future." Grace looked down at Ellie's smiling face, then up at her husband's loving gaze, and knew that some dreams came true in ways you never expected, but were all the more precious for the journey taken to reach them. Spring arrived the following year, with a riot of wildflowers across the prairie and new life on the Jackson ranch. The cattle herd had grown, with calves wobbling on spindly legs beside their mothers. The vegetable garden Grace had expanded now provided not only for their table, but extra to sell in town. And Ellie, now 16 months old, was walking confidently and adding new words to her vocabulary daily. "Mama," she called, toddling across the yard as Grace hung laundry on the line. "Up!" Grace scooped her up, delighting in the way Ellie's arms wrapped trustingly around her neck. "Are you helping Papa with the chickens?" she asked, nodding toward where Kieran was repairing a section of the henhouse. "Papa fix," Ellie confirmed solemnly. "Ellie help." "I'm sure you were a big help," Grace assured her, pressing a kiss to the child's soft cheek. Kieran straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers as he approached them. 6 months of marriage had only deepened Grace's love for him, his steadiness, his gentle humor, his unwavering devotion to both her and Ellie. "How are my two favorite ladies?" he asked, wrapping an arm around Grace's waist and dropping a kiss on Ellie's head. "Busy as always," Grace replied, leaning into his embrace. "I'm almost finished with the laundry, and then I need to start on dinner. The Turners are coming at 6. Remember?" "I remember," Kieran assured her. "I'll clean up and help with the preparations." Life had settled into comfortable patterns since their wedding. They lived primarily in Kieran's house, though Grace's cabin was maintained for storage and occasional use when ranch work kept them on that side of the property. They'd combined their operations successfully, with Kieran focusing on the cattle and horses, while Grace managed the smaller livestock, garden, and household. Their home had become a gathering place for neighbors and friends, with frequent Sunday dinners and occasional social events. Grace found joy in these gatherings, in creating a warm, welcoming environment that reflected the love at the center of their family. Later that evening, after the Turners had departed and Ellie was tucked into bed, Grace and Kieran sat on the porch swing, enjoying the mild spring air. His arm was around her shoulders, her head resting comfortably against him as they gently rocked. "I received a letter from John today," Kieran said, referring to his foreman in Montana. "The ranch there is doing well. He's increased the herd by 15% this year." "That's wonderful," Grace replied. "Do you ever miss it? Montana?" Kieran was silent for a moment, considering. "I miss the mountains sometimes," he admitted. "The way they change color with the light, but not enough to trade what I have here." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Not nearly enough?" Grace smiled, warmed by his certainty. "I have something to tell you," she said, sitting up slightly to look at him. "Something important." Kieran's brow furrowed slightly at her serious tone. "What is it, love? Is something wrong?" "No," Grace assured him quickly. "Nothing's wrong. In fact..." She took a deep breath, joy bubbling up inside her. "I'm going to have a baby. Our baby." Kieran went utterly still, his expression frozen in disbelief. "But the doctor in Silver Creek, he said..." "I know what he said," Grace interrupted gently. "But Dr. Harrison in Bismarck confirms it. I'm about 2 months along." "A baby," Kieran whispered, his hand moving instinctively to rest on her still flat stomach. "Grace, are you sure?" She nodded, covering his hand with her own. "Dr. Harrison said sometimes these things happen. What looks impossible can suddenly change." She smiled softly. "Rather like a stranger appearing on your doorstep with an infant, I suppose." The joy that spread across Kieran's face was like sunrise breaking over the prairie. "A miracle," he breathed, gathering her into his arms. "Our miracle." As he held her, murmuring words of love and wonder against her hair, Grace thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the depths of grief and loss, through an unconventional arrangement born of necessity, to a love and family more fulfilling than she'd ever imagined possible. Ellie would have a sibling, a brother or sister, to grow up with on this land they were building together. Kieran would have the chance to be a father from the beginning, to witness every milestone, and Grace would finally experience the joy she'd thought forever denied to her. "I love you," Kieran said, his voice thick with emotion. "You and Ellie and this new little one, more than I have words to express." "I know," Grace whispered, because she did know, felt it in every gentle touch, every shared smile, every quiet moment of their life together. "I love you too." As they sat entwined on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Grace felt a profound sense of completion. Her dreams hadn't faded after all. They had simply been waiting for the right time, the right people, to bring them fully to life. In the years that followed, the Jackson Ranch prospered and grew, as did their family. Grace gave birth to a healthy son they named Thomas Kieran, in honor of both the past and present. 2 years later, twin girls arrived, Elizabeth Margaret and Anne Marie, completing their family with joyful chaos. Ellie grew into a beautiful, confident young woman, fiercely protective of her younger siblings and proudly claiming both Grace and Kieran as her parents. Though they never hid the truth of her birth from her, in every way that mattered, she was their daughter, the first miracle that had brought them together. The Dakota Territory changed around them, eventually becoming part of the state of South Dakota. Towns grew, railroads expanded, and the wild frontier gradually gave way to more settled communities. Through it all, the Jackson Ranch remained a cornerstone of the region, known for quality livestock and the generous hospitality of its owners. On warm summer evenings, Grace and Kieran would often sit on their porch, watching their children play in the yard that had once seemed so empty. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Grace would remember that day so long ago, a thunderstorm brewing on the horizon, her heart heavy with the weight of dreams that seemed lost forever, and then the cry of a baby changing everything. "What are you thinking about?" Kieran would ask, noticing her reflective smile, and Grace would lean into his embrace, watching their children, the family that had once seemed impossible, and answer simply, "How dreams come true in the most unexpected ways." It was enough. It was everything. It was theirs at last.